these webinars and other CHN resources would not be possible without the incredibly generous support of our funders. We have a slide with
Yes.
our funders on it. So thank you all. Okay, and now to our program. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers, and then I'm going to turn it off to Celinda to lead us off. Our first speaker is often described as the godmother of politics, which is a lot to live up to, and is arguably the most influential woman in her field. Celinda leverages her position and prominence to promote issues especially important to all of us, including healthcare, education, the environment, and human rights. She is the Democratic pollster for many media outlets and is an advisor and commentator on several national news programs. She served as chief pollster for legions of congressional leaders, presidential campaigns, and has served in numerous capacities to support organizational clients, many of whom are members of CHN. We always appreciate how generous Celinda is with her time and expertise, and she's a valued resource to CHN and our member organizations. And for those of you who are Yellowstone fans, when researching her, I found out she was born and raised in Montana and grew up on a ranch. And turns out we have friends in common in Helena. Who knew? Our second speaker is Ismael Cid Martinez, and he is an economist with EPI, the Economic Policy Institute's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy. He studies income inequality and well-being within the frameworks of stratification economics, human development, and political economy. He has co-authored and published research on child poverty and welfare, intergroup disparities, retirement security and public finance, and the capability approach. And he will explain to us what all that means. Prior to joining EPI, Ismael worked for the U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee, where he authored reports on economic inequality and racial and ethnic disparities in the labor market and the broader economy. And in his spare time, he is a PhD candidate at the New School for Social Research. Pretty impressive, Ismael. And finally, our fearless leader, Deb Weinstein. As many of you know, she joined CHN as our executive director in June of 2003, after years of serving on the CHN board and supporting our program priorities, very much appropriate to today's webinar on strategies to lift children and their families out of poverty. She did this during her tenure as the director of the Family Income Division of the Children's Defense Fund. So with that, you all now know our speakers, and I'm going to turn it over to Celinda to start us off. And please put your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. And it is a complete delight to be part of this. And I want to say there's no one I admire more than Deb Weinstein. And I would go anywhere for her, but this is pure pleasure to be with this group. And I love EPI's work. And of course, FRAC has set the agenda and continues to set the agenda on a crucial issue. I want to also acknowledge our team, Alicia Snell and Jenna Scarborough, who's on this call, who are very, very involved in children and women's issues and family issues and poverty. So I want to share with you some of the data that is out there. The data is remarkably positive, and what we find, honestly, is that the voters are way ahead of the elites and the elected officials. And in general, they tend to be extremely supportive of children's programs, even though only 28% of voters have children under 18. So let's look at the summary, and then I'll show you quickly the data. All of these slides can be available to you through the coalition. Half of voters, more than half of voters, and most subgroups think the federal government is spending too little on children. And we deliberately asked the hard question. We used the dreaded F word, federal, and we said spending too little where a lot of people, worried about spending might say it's about right, but people overwhelmingly think there's something wrong here. 6 in 10 voters are very concerned about the levels of child poverty in America, and they are concerned about the cost as well of addressing it. 2/3 think we spend too little money on reducing child poverty, and it is tied for the top problem with people for such issues like affordable housing and helping low-income families meet basic needs. So getting children out of poverty is way, way under discussed. And a lot of people think of this as an old frame, but it's very current for voters. One of the edgier questions we asked, and one of the funner ones, nearly 6 to 1 voters agree Congress shouldn't pass any more tax breaks for big corporations unless there's support for families in there too. There remains and always has been very strong support for CHIP, permanently funding it and making it a permanent health insurance program. The child tax credit, wildly popular with voters, way more popular with voters than people had any idea. 7 in 10 voters support it, and you can see our question wording, and 57% have intense support for it. And there are a number of pollsters, Garen Hart, Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner, ourselves, who have polled on the child tax credit. All of the polls show a strong support for the child tax credit. The strongest language mentions children and grandchildren, invokes the values of fairness, stability, inclusivity, protection, and focusing on families staying above water and using it to make basic needs. This issue is becoming more current, not less, because as you know from the economic data, people have used up their savings and are now acquiring credit card debt in pretty high numbers. Macro statements focusing on cutting poverty and creating long-term benefits also work well. But the combination of really putting a face on this and then talking about core values is our strongest messaging. We also have very strong messages that we do not need work requirements for CTC. And people are very expansive in their notion of what work is, including volunteering and caregiving. And they're really not, when it comes to children in poverty, they're really not oriented toward kind of punitive authoritative measures. So let's go look at this data and see if you draw the same conclusions. On the next page, you'll see 56% say there's too little spent on funding that benefits children. 10% say too much. Notice even Republicans say 33% say too little, 24% say about right, and 21% say too much. So every subgroup has a plurality, and many subgroups have very intense support for there being too little spent on programs that benefit children. If we look at the next slide, we see that people are very concerned about poverty. And when we worded it 2 different ways. We said, how concerned are you that the level of poverty is 59% higher than the level of adult poverty in America? And that negatively impacts all aspects of children, including their health, education, safety. 83% of the public said they were concerned, 60% very concerned. And when we asked the cost and the long-term cost, and we said, how concerned are you that child poverty costs our society up to $1.1 trillion a year due to higher crime, healthcare, and lower incomes? 86% said that is very concerning. So high levels of concern for the level of poverty among children, high levels of concern for the short-term and long-term costs of that poverty among children. People, if we look at the next slide, have a host of reasons why they would be interested in supporting children and specific problems that they think children face. And they include, at the very top, reducing child abuse and neglect, accessing mental health services, which has soared in the last couple of years, reducing child poverty, reducing child homelessness, reducing child hunger. People are absolutely appalled at the rates of child hunger. The one issue that isn't very strong about children is providing children access to vaccines, including COVID vaccine, And that's because people think, well, we've done that. We do it. It's out there. We're spending about the right money on it. But on all these other programs, people think overwhelmingly that we are spending too little money on all of these aspects of children. When we ask the next question about how do you see this as a political issue, we said many families are facing rising costs and struggling to make ends meet. We still see tax breaks for corporations prioritized over tax relief for families. Do you agree or disagree? Congress shouldn't pass any more tax breaks for big corporations unless there's support for families too. 80% of Americans agree, 56% strongly. This is a core value, and it is a value that strikes universally. 67% of Republicans, 87% of independents, 89% of Democrats agree with this. It is across the board. It is very intensely felt, and it's almost a core value more than a policy position in people's minds. There is very, very strong support for CHIP, and we have seen the healthcare issue really re-emerging in the data, and people are overwhelmingly supportive of permanently funding it and making it a permanent health insurance program. 79%, 59% think it's important and very important, and 78% favor it, 66% strongly. And in fact, if anything, people would expand this program. They would actually allow people to cover children even longer than the current age requirements, because people are quite aware of young people having trouble getting insurance. When we look at the children's tax credit, and this is probably the most surprising data I'll show you, unless you've been on some of our other presentations. People think the child tax credit was kind of a 50-50 proposition. Not at all. 72% of the public favored it, 57% strongly. Only 21% opposed it. 90% of Democrats favored it. 62% of independents, and 55% of Republicans. Solid, 3/4 of every demographic group. And this description that we provided is one of the most successful descriptions that we found. Let me read you information about a tax credit that Congress passed in 2020. The child tax credit is an expanded and improved tax credit that refunds middle-class families and families with low incomes more money for each child under 18, creates a new tax credit for children or families with children under 6, and makes the credit fully refundable for all families with low incomes. Do you favor or oppose the child tax credit? And again, the numbers overwhelmingly in favor. Why does this work? What is really strong with the public, and what are some messaging tips here? First of all, Republicans very, very strong on it. And people like including both referring to children and grandchildren, by the way. Again, remember, only 28% of all voters have children under 18. A lot of people are reacting as grandparents, even more than parents. It also helps to talk about the positive rather than the negative. We often start with the problems. We often start with the loss narrative. That's much less positive for people than an asset, what we can do, what we can invest in. And it helps to say that we're going to invest in children and grandchildren for a better future rather than invest because families are falling behind. Poverty is a vague concept to people. And notice we've deliberately used poverty, but it's really effective to talk about things easing the burden of inflation and rising costs. That's the current way that people think, and it makes them very, very motivated to deal with poverty and low income and poor families. People also support both talking about CTC as a gain, something new that we've done, or talking about it as a loss. Often the loss has been the stronger way to talk about things, but a lot of people have no idea of the legislative history of CTC. They just know that some things were present for a while and disappeared. It also works very well to talk about this affecting working and middle-class families who are facing rising prices. If we look at the next chart, you can see messages for the child tax credit. And I think these messages would largely apply to poverty programs as well. And you can see some references to poverty in some of these messages. We think we have a good message when we have 40% or close to that thinking it's very convincing, and 60% thinking it's convincing. And here you can see more than that. But our top two messages are: there are hundreds of tax credits for corporations and billionaires, but only one tax credit for children with families. Taking the child tax credit away from struggling parents who can't find a job would push children into poverty rather than helping families. And all children deserve the opportunity to succeed, no matter their class or zip code. The child tax credit is there to support children, and denying or taking away the child tax credit from those whose families cannot find a job at some point only punishes children whose families are already stretched thin. These are very strong arguments against the work requirement. The work requirement is popular with people, but we can push back on it very, very easily when we talk about children. And you will see that those pushbacks in the next slide are popular with Democrats, independents, and Republicans. All of them support these arguments by over 50%. And for Democrats, it's like 85% convincing. There are also a number of arguments in favor of the child tax credit. These were arguments to push back on the work requirement. There are several very strong arguments for the child tax credit: that it keeps families' heads above water so they don't resort to payday loans, selling their blood plasma pawn shops; that recipients spent 90% of the money on food, utilities, and basics; and that academic studies have found that in a short time, it can cut child poverty by over 40%. 3.7 million children moved out of poverty. This is a very important message, because what is stronger for us, honestly, against us, is not opposition messaging, but rather cynicism. People wonder, can this really work? Is it really working? And that message really convinced people that it works. When we ask people what is the most important issue, you can see here cutting poverty and the long-term gains, as well as the expanded is a 10-to-1 payoff. The most important reasons to them for supporting the child tax credit. So that's a very quick lay of the land. I look forward to your questions. And again, all of this data available to you through the coalition.
Unmute.
Unmute. We've been getting quite a few questions, so I'm going to ask you a couple and ask for brevity, please. First question: if there is such strong grassroots support for spending on child poverty and poverty-related efforts, then how could that be translated into legislative action? Currently, sitting legislators generally do not seem to share these priorities.
It's a really good question. And I think there are two things that need to be done. First of all, everybody talks about kids. Every politician kisses a baby. Every politician buys an ice cream cone for a teenager. There's, as the children's hospitals used to say, who's for children and who's for kids and who's just kidding. And people think both parties are kidding. So we need accountability. And this is a place where the allies of the coalition. The second thing is, if anything, the agenda is too broad. When people want to stand up for seniors, they know what to do. Go fight for Social Security and Medicaid. When people want to stand up for children, they think, oh my God, there's just too much to do. So unfortunately, I think the community has to focus on some things to get people's attention, and no more than 3 to 5 things. And that's really hard because the agenda is really broad. And then the last thing is we should be more assertive. We should encourage our friends to talk more about this. Our friends will support us, but they don't assume it's anywhere near as popular as it is, including with non-parents.
Thank you. And finally, gun violence is the #1 killer of children, yet gun control was second to the bottom. Thoughts on that lack of correlation with care about children's well-being?
Yeah, really good question. So the gun issue is polarizing, and actually that it was as high as it was coming from gun-toting Montana and a ranch family, I was surprised the numbers were as high as they were. And you'll notice while it was down there, it was still at 49% and almost 2/3. So I would say that when you come to children and when you come to violence on children, there is really a lot of energy. And you had 53% who want to prevent gun violence. So I think the children's angle is the way to move on gun violence, and we have so many unlikely spokesperson. We have the police chief of Uvalde. We have all these different, or one of the police officials from Uvalde. We have all these different voices. The police chief from Sandy Hook, the legislator from Uvalde is what I meant to say. We have all these different voices now that have come together on this, and it's really, really moving with the public, particularly with women, and particularly with people in suburban and urban environments.
Great. Well, there are a lot more questions and we can go on for a lot longer, but thank you so much for your time and expertise. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ismail.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It is so great to be with all of you and all the partners of the coalition. For many years, I've relied a lot on your expertise and understanding of social policy in the US and the implications, the economic implications of that. So as my slides come up shortly, I will be talking a little bit about how child poverty, so very much in line with Celinda's presentation, about how child poverty can serve as an important measure of economic progress and equity generally. And the reason why I wanted to focus a little bit on this is because I have a sense that much of the conversation next week will be dominated by what happened to the supplemental child poverty rate, given the expiration of the child tax credit. So what I hopefully put this particular metric into context and give us a sense of how that also gives us insights into equity concerns. So I'll start by, in the next slide, highlighting some of the motivations for our engagement at PRE and the Economic Policy Institute with poverty statistics. For one, they really enable us to identify the extent and magnitude of economic disparities. And these are disparities by race, ethnicity, gender, and class that we really see as defining features of the US economy. Now, in order to assess this progress, we place changes within the context of both absolute and relative differences. And I promise that I will provide examples of that so you get a sense of what I'm talking about. But essentially, we're concerned with such questions as, how does the prevalence of child poverty compare to some point in the past? For example, we're looking at 2021 relative to maybe 2019. But we don't stop just there, right? We also want to get a sense of what are the relative differences or gaps between groups, and how have these gaps evolved over time? That also gives us a sense of some of the equity considerations that we want to make sure we understand. And ultimately, we look at these trends to obtain a better sense of the factors that are driving these outcomes, right? And a lot of this has to do with social and economic policy, but also the role that structural racism continues to play in determining economic outcomes in the US economy. Now, in the next slide, I talk a little bit about why child poverty. If you are concerned, well, Ismail, if you're concerned with economic policy and you're concerned with economic equity, why look at child poverty? Why is that important? I like to think of this at least in two respects. One of them has to do with the fact that child poverty constitutes a violation of the rights of the child. Sorry, the previous slide. There you go. So it constitutes a violation of the rights of the child. That is, rights stipulated under the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which the majority of countries signed, and almost all countries have ratified. The US will hopefully get there soon. But children have the right to an adequate standard of living. And the reason for this is because deprivations, we know this, that deprivations at a young age also threaten other rights that children have associated with survival, healthy development, and even their agency. That is, the beings and doings that they wish to maximize in the future or to realize. And earlier, Ellen talked about, well, what is capability approach? Maybe you'll give us an insight into that. Well, that is really that, right? What are the substantive freedoms that children have access to? And we see these as essential rights that they have intrinsic value to, irrespective of where they are or their race or ethnicity, right? Or gender or class. Now, there's also an instrumental role to child poverty, which is why, as a student of economics, I'm also very interested in this metric, right? And that is because child poverty is not one-dimensional. That is, it depends on a number of factors, including the employment and income security of parents, access to social protection systems, and also the adequacy of some of these support systems, whether or not the benefits that families receive actually help them make ends meet. Now, we also know that material shortcomings at a very young age impact children throughout the, or individuals throughout the entire life cycle, right? We see that deprivations at a young age in health and education have impacts in the labor market, and even ultimately as far as their retirement security. And if we are concerned with poverty and equity, then we need to be concerned with children in the sense that inequities really begin there at a young age, mostly because they compound and multiply over time. So it's very difficult to close existing gaps or narrow existing gaps in wealth and income without really starting with children. Now, in the next slide, and this also gets to the question of like, why child poverty? What is the explanatory power of this metric? Well, it turns out that in the US, this matters perhaps more than any other place in the rich world, right? Because we continue to lag behind other rich countries in metrics of child well-being. And many of you know this is very well documented. Now, this suboptimal performance is a function of a lot of things, but mostly policy choices. It remains a policy choice. And also structural inequities that continue to be embedded within the economy. As you know, low-income families and children of color are left particularly vulnerable to economic shocks and contractions. And we see this each time that there's a change in the business cycle, whether it's caused by a pandemic or a financial crisis. We see that these families and children are severely disadvantaged relative to their peers. Now, the good news in some respect is that child poverty is highly responsive to public policy and to social policy, right? And the expansion of the CTC under the American Rescue Plan and other economic security measures that we implemented in response to the once-in-a-lifetime public health crisis really gave us insights into this and made it real, made us realize that, oh, wait, this metric is really responsive to what's happening in the public policy space. In the next slide, we'll see some empirical evidence of this, right? We see, for example, that public investments actually did help reduce child poverty, and this is a supplemental child poverty, which I prefer over the official poverty measure, because supplemental child poverty rates accounts for geographic variations in living costs. It factors like in-kind transfers into CTC are reflected in this metric, right? And Debbie will go over a lot of this information as well in her conversation soon. But we can see that between 2019 and 2021, child poverty fell by more than half as a result of all these public investments in response to, including the expansion of the CTC, but also other relief measures like stimulus payments in response to the pandemic. And this decline really took place across racial and ethnic groups. Of course, we see that the incidence of child poverty is a little bit, the prevalence of child poverty, it's higher for children of color relative to white children, even after these transfers in 2021. But nevertheless, we see a decline by more than half for Black and Hispanic children from 2019 to 2021. So we know, and our response, our bold policy response to the pandemic reminded us that this metric is indeed highly responsive to economic policy and to social policy, right? Now, this is not the complete story, right? Because in some sense, we do want to get a sense of what's happening to the share of children. What is the share of children that fall below the poverty line, for example? 20% of Black children were poor, according to the supplemental poverty rate in 2019, and only 8% in 2021, right? But how does that poverty rate compare relative to white children? So in the next slide, I express these poverty rates as ratios relative to white children, white non-Hispanic children, right? To get a sense also of how entrenched do the inequities that we see in the American economy really remain, right? And what we see is that even after accounting for a lot of these transfers that made a significant difference in helping families weather the economic shock, Black and Hispanic children were 3 times as likely as their white non-Hispanic peers to fall below the poverty line. And the ratio for Asian American children, they're twice as likely, but this understates the gap, right? Because in some respect, this doesn't reflect a lot of the deprivations that we see across Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander children, right? So in some ways, what we see for the Asian white ratio understates a lot of those inequities. Nevertheless, these disparities remain entrenched, as you can see, since if we look back a decade or so. In fact, a lot of the disparities, in particular for Black children, have risen since then, right? Circa 2029, for example, Black children were twice as likely to fall below the poverty line relative to 2021. They're 3 times as likely, right? So what does this mean? Well, what it tells us also is that if we are concerned with these structural inequities that remain embedded in economic policy in the US, we also need to think about a broad basket of policy solutions that can also address how structural racism shapes outcomes for children, for low-income families and children of color. Now, in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what do we expect looking ahead. Well, what we know for certain is that the bold policy response to the pandemic, as we see in the poverty statistics from 2021 and before, made a substantial difference in alleviating deprivation for children, low-income families, and children of color. It enabled a lot of these families, in particular the CTC, to respond to this shock. Now, also, again, structural inequities remain entrenched. So we also need to look beyond a lot of the measures that we've taken and make sure that the needs of children are actually part of the public discourse, as Celinda alluded to. Now, what do we expect next week? What does this all mean? What do we expect to see next week when the poverty estimates for 2022 are released? And we will have an upcoming piece on this, hopefully by the end of this week at EPI, talking about what we expect to see. But essentially, there are 3 factors that are likely to influence changes in child poverty in 2002. One of them has to do with the expiration of the child tax credit, right, which is likely to increase the incidence of child poverty, the prevalence of child poverty, the share of children that fall below the poverty line. And this will be reflected in the supplemental poverty rate. But there's also the inflation shock of as we continue to unwind and recover from a once-in-a-lifetime public health crisis, global public health crisis. So the inflation shock is also likely to have influence in increasing child poverty for 2022. And the other component is the strong labor market recovery, in particular as it relates for low-wage workers. Sadly, we have the sense that the first 2 factors are more likely to dominate rather than the strong recovery. That is, the expiration of the child tax credit and the impact of inflation are likely to dominate the trend and reflect an increase in child poverty. We could talk a little bit about the magnitude of that increase. In an optimistic scenario, it's probably something along the lines of 2020 estimates or so, and a very pessimistic scenario is probably closer to 2019 estimates, but somewhere within that range, right? Now, it's important to remember, and I say this mostly for myself, right, as a student of economics who has a very myopic understanding of what constitutes well-being. I feel like the majority of you here fully understand this, but it's important to really understand too how, when we're talking about these metrics next week, that child poverty and monetary poverty really understates the deprivation that children suffer. For example, a lot of you already had questions about gun violence, about mental health, other matters that impact the well-being of children. Now, a lot of these dimensions of well-being are not reflected in income and poverty statistics. So I think it's important to provide some context when we're discussing also these metrics, that they don't fully explain a lot of the factors that influence the well-being of children. Now, I end with my contact information in case you would all like to follow up and discuss much of this with Greater East. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Great, a lot to digest. I'm going to throw a couple questions out at you. How does immigration status impact on even US born children?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is one of those things that one of these dimensions that is not often captured in a lot of these like monetary metrics that we look at poverty, right? But the matter of the fact is that a lot of these children face hardships that often they don't qualify for a lot of the in-kind transfers, for example, that other families and children qualify for. So it's likely that their deprivation is much more severe than what we expect, right? And also they face violation of rights as it relates to their personhood, in the sense that they're oftentimes don't have legal representation in a place where they reside, right? So I think these are that's another lens through which we can look at child well-being, right? Which is that the deprivations that children suffer are also impacted by matters like whether or not they have recognition as legal citizens in where they live.
Thank you. And finally, the question is, did most people realize that many families only received a half of the amount due to them because they didn't file a tax return in 2022? Can you talk about the impact of that?
Yeah, and I think that this is true, right? I think when we look at some of the inequities that persist in like when we were looking at the ratios, the relative gaps, I think that part of it is also a function of the fact that not everyone was touched alike by some of these policies. A lot of this had to do with some of these like individual factors, but also because perhaps a lot of this information is not even like provided in the language that folks perhaps speak their native tongue. If they're, if they speak Spanish and they don't fully understand how they can qualify for a lot of programs and such, not just the CTC, right? So I think that this gets to this issue also as well of when we think about social protection measures, whether social insurance or social assistance, how do we think about improving access and adequacy, right? So that we reach more families, and also so that the transfers are actually adequate and really make a difference in helping families achieve their basic needs and necessities.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to read, this is a comment, not a question. When discussing public investments that helped reduce child poverty, in addition to the CTC, we should also talk about Medicaid, housing stability, and the other expanded pandemic benefits. And as one who works on food and nutrition policy, the summer, pandemic EBT and also the SNAP emergency allotments play heavily into that as well. But I am going to let Deb Weinstein just take all this information, digest it, and give us our marching orders as she always does. Deb? Deb, you're muted.
Yeah, you would think I would get this by now. Thank you very much. And Ismail, that was terrific and very thought-provoking. Yes, there's a lot to grab onto here. I think I have an approximately 9-hour presentation. And I'll talk fast. So Leo, I'm relying on you to put my slides up, and we'll talk through practical ways to answer some of the questions that you've raised. So as we started, the name of this whole thing, How to Reduce Poverty Using New Data to Show the Way. Okay, let's move along here. So first thing to know, there's a lot of data, some of which is coming out next week, as you've been hearing about, some of which is already available and that can augment what we're trying to do To go back to the question that was asked, the very good question, if there's such strong support for this, how come we're not winning on all these things? And it's because minorities are talking to members of Congress or senators who have relied on those minorities to get elected and stay elected. And we can change that only by speaking out and showing them that there is a majority that cares about these issues. So we can use the data that's coming out on the 12th, that's next Tuesday, and it comes from a census survey called the Current Population Survey, and you will see there both the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure. And Ismail made the excellent point that we're really going to focus a lot on the supplemental poverty measure, and I'll tell you more about it in a second. September 14th is the sort of part 2 of the census release. It's from a larger sample called the American Community Survey. A lot of you have been asking about state data, and while these surveys don't ask opinions about things, they measure access to benefits and levels of poverty and income, health insurance, many other things. And the American Community Survey is large enough that it can have breakdowns by demographics, racial and other demographics, and it can do it at the state level and at the city level and the congressional district level, counties, so very useful to many of us. The Census Household Pulse data is a survey that's been put into the field on a regular basis. It started in April 2020. The most recent data came out last month, and there'll be more releases coming out this month, October and November. And it does not talk about poverty or income directly. It talks more about examples of hardship, such as have you had enough to eat, or are you having a hard time paying your rent, and questions like that. Usually at this time we talk about household food security data from the year before, in this case 22, from the Department of Agriculture. It's not out yet. They've made some changes in their survey, and they'll release it October 25th, and we'll tell you about it when they do. Leo, you can change. We know from the year from 20 to 21, which is what was measured when the data came out last year, that was a period where there was a great deal of pandemic-related assistance. You've heard a lot about the child tax credit. That was one of those forms of assistance. And that showed up very significantly. Here's a chart from the wonderful Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It shows this is, this very, very substantial reduction in child poverty when you count those benefits. And so we're very worried. Those benefits mostly ended in 2021. And so now we'll be having data from 2022, and we're real worried about what that's going to show. Next slide. So the Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy, again, this is data that's been coming out. The most recent that's up on their website goes through May of this year. So goes a lot further along in time than the new data that's coming out next Tuesday. And it does show that that there was a tremendous reduction, very consistent with the other data, in poverty when all these benefits were being received. And if you look at that arrow somewhat to the left, where it says large share of EIT, CTC, and stimulus checks distributed. That was around March of 21. And at that time, you know, that shows the poverty level going considerably down. The light blue line is what they're tracking. And then you can see in May, the very end to the right, those benefits have gone away and poverty is starting to climb, unfortunately. So that is our preview of what we're expecting, although we won't know until the data come out. Next slide. So here again, this is if you want to kind of study up and see what the comparisons were and see why we're so much more focused on the supplemental poverty measure as opposed to the official poverty measure. Official poverty measure didn't count all those benefits. And so it didn't show when improvement was happening. The official poverty measure even showed total poverty slightly rising from 20 to 21, whereas the supplemental poverty measure and the top line that says total is everyone of any age, it shows a decline using the supplemental poverty measure. As some of the other data that Ismail and others have shown by race, everybody does better through all those benefits. But we do, you know, if we want to address the tremendous racial and ethnic disparities, the supplemental poverty measure was showing how those benefits were helping. And again, child poverty, the under 18 group, substantial reduction, a much, much lower reduction using the official measure. Okay, the next one. Okay, so this is, I'll zoom past this because you've seen it from Ismail. You're getting the picture here. Supplemental poverty measure does show this reduction in poverty when the benefits exist. And we are worried that now that those extra benefits have gone away, that the supplemental poverty measure may very well show an increase in poverty. Next one. One of the disadvantages of the supplemental poverty measure, and many of the questions had to do, have you got state data? And I don't blame you, we want state data. The supplemental poverty measure, unfortunately, has pretty inadequate state data. You'll see some, and this again is from last year's. First of all, in order to have a big enough sample size, it averages 3 years worth. And that kind of masks the big improvement that occurred in 2021. Also, you can't get breakdowns. We want to see breakdowns by race. We want to see breakdowns by age. It will only say the total poverty level utilizing the supplemental poverty measure, but you will see that. Next slide. And here's one more thing about the supplemental poverty measure. The report very importantly shows, taking each item by item, the anti-poverty effectiveness, how many people are lifted out of poverty, and they show it in this graph, of course, doesn't give all the detail, but there are also tables so you can see the exact numbers. But just to show the example where I have the blue arrow, and someone asked about older people. Well, Social Security is our standout program for reducing poverty. 26.3 million people last year were lifted out of poverty because of it. All the refundable tax credits together, EITC and child tax credit, lifted 9.6 million people out of poverty. The child tax credit alone lifted, and that's, I guess, is that a purple line? Lifted more than 5 million people out of poverty. And SNAP and school lunch together lifted 3.4 million people out of poverty. all of these are extraordinarily important, and you'll be able to see that data. But we're guessing that the 22 data will show many fewer people were lifted out of poverty by the refundable tax credits, especially the child tax credit. And I think SNAP as well, because those benefits went down. Ellen can comment on that, but we're very concerned about that. So next slide. So on the 12th, this, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but it tells you that starting at 10 a.m., there'll be a press event that the Census Bureau will have, where they will be releasing the data, official and supplemental poverty measure, health insurance, income, and you can get at it either through that WebEx link. When we send you everything, you'll have live links, don't worry, or you can watch it on YouTube, on the Census Live page, whatever you want. And around when they're not right at the beginning, but usually a little before the thing is over, they'll start putting all of the reports actually on the website so you can get them. On that day, it'll be very prominently visible on the census.gov website. So next slide. We'll have health insurance data. One of the things they always show is the much better record for keeping people insured if it's a state that picked up the Medicaid expansion. When the states that did not do that have much higher levels of people who are uninsured, and we expect that that will continue to be the case. We know we're in the midst right now of states redetermining the eligibility of people to be on Medicaid. That didn't happen during the pandemic. And we are worried that this year in 2023, so far about 5 million people have lost Medicaid, but that's not going to show up yet in the 22 data that we'll be seeing next Tuesday. Next slide. We'll also see money about income, various measures of income. Right now, I'm just encouraging you to take a look at income inequality. Last year, the change up from 20 to 21 showed that every group except for the highest fifth lost a little bit of ground, as you can see in this comparison. The richest gained a bit, and the richer they were, the more they gained. So that's certainly an ongoing issue for us as to whether we have economic justice. So next slide. Here too, and Ismail was very beneficial to us in showing some of the racial and ethnic differences. This is a slide from the census report that does show income differences by race and ethnicity. Excuse me, next slide. Just wanted you to see, you know, when people talk about poverty, it's important that you know what the census defines as the level below which you're poor. This is the levels that they're using now for the data you'll be seeing. On rare occasions, they make a last minute change. I kind of doubt it, but you should check on the 12th to make sure that these are still the thresholds, but they should be. So next slide. And we won't even talk about this right now because we're running late, but the here are gang of examples of various takes on poverty, and you can look at these, some state data, but it's mostly national data. Next slide. Okay, American Community Survey, September 14th. Because it's so big, as we've said, you can get those state breakdowns and lower geographies, congressional district, counties, etc. And also we can answer a lot of different kinds of questions. Some of the questions people said, isn't housing important? Yeah, you bet it's important. There are ways of getting at some of those other questions that aren't so much in the other data that we've talked about. So we're gonna show you how to find this data. Next slide. Well, problems uses the official poverty definition, so that is a problem. But of course, the advantage is, as we've mentioned, it covers, it's big enough so that you can do those breakdowns. You can say what poverty is, the racial breakdowns in your state or your county, and that's very important, and you can't get it in other ways. Next one. Okay, so now we're gonna stop screen sharing. This is my idea of high risk behavior. Leo's gonna stop sharing, and I will start sharing the live census website because it seemed easier just to show you. Let me see if I can get this. Okay. So here I am in the wonderful land of Google. And what I'm going to do is show you, and I hasten to say, this information is going to be in step-by-step instructions. But what I'm doing is opening up the census specific website to get information. It's data.census.gov. So here's what we do. We start with that. Then we go to advanced search. See where that, I've just clicked on that. Now we want to tell it which survey we want. And we want the American Community Survey. So I clicked on survey. Now I'm clicking on American Community Survey. I'm clicking on 1 year estimates. And for our example right now, I'm going to take comparison profiles because that looks over time. In this case, last year's from 21 to 17, but we want to do a state, not just the nation. So I clicked on geography, and now I'm state. And if we had time, I'd do a poll to pick which state, but we don't, so I'm picking Florida. So now I've asked it all these questions, and I'm going to search for what they have. And I don't know if you can all see it, but in the lower right, there is a box that says search. I hope that's visible.
Yeah, we see it.
So I'm clicking on that. Now I'm having, because all my Q&As are sort of getting in the way of this. But we want to try the CP03, comparative economic characteristics. So I'm clicking on that and I'm getting rid of the Q&As for a bit. And we want it to show up on the whole screen. And you'll notice there's these double arrows. And if I click on them, there it is. So here we've got this extremely useful table, and it's got lots of data, and you can pick which you use. So this is Florida. You can pick your own state, or you can go to sub-state regions. We don't have a lot of time at all. So, but if you look, I'm giving you a headache from my looking here. I did want to see, okay, just to give an example of how you can make a case for childcare. So here we have own children of the householder under 6 years. That's what I'm pointing to. And right below it, it says, all parents in the family are in the labor force. So in the most current data in Florida, and this was 2021, there are 1.2 million children under the age of 6, prime kids for needing childcare, and more than 2/3 of these families have all the parents that are in that family out in the labor force. So they probably really need childcare. And you will take my word for it, but if we scroll, well, take my word for it, if we scroll, you can see all the years of data, and it does show that that number's gone up. It was 65.6%, now it's higher. So that's a tremendous number of people who need some form of childcare. And you can compare data that you may have about how much childcare is available in your state. And we will send you links from the first 5-year fund, for instance, that has state data to show you that really there isn't a lot of childcare available, a lot of subsidized childcare available in Florida, and you can do it for your state. So that'll help you make a case. As you can see, there's lots more data in this table, income levels, and if we keep going with patients, there's health insurance data here. And this one, even though you can't read the whole thing, if we make it bigger, you can see that this is the one below here talks about percentages of families and people below the poverty line. And you can see what happened over time in Florida, any other state. We like to use all people under 18 or the children, and you can see these different estimates. So I'm going to stop sharing this now, but you see how you use this table. And if you want to try something else, you can clear all filters. I want to really make sure I want to do that, but I do. And if we start all over again, again, the survey is American Community Survey, 1-year estimates. This time I'm going to go to selected population profiles. And just to show you, this is very important. If you go to topics, you get and choose race and ethnicity. This is where then we choose all available races. And let's pick another state. You can see it doesn't really matter exactly what order. Now I'm picking Georgia. And there's one table with this information, which I'm having a hard time. Okay, here we go. So here's Georgia, and here's this giant table with a giant number of racial groups. And I would just say, and we don't really have time now, but you can just see zillions of racial groups. If you keep scrolling towards the right, you want to look for Hispanic or Latino may be of any race. That's how they talk about it. That should be one topic. Someone wanted to know whether there were indigenous numbers. Yes, there are many variants here. You can choose what you want. There's American Indian tribes, alone or in combination. There's American Indian or Alaska Native. There are lots of different alternatives. You can pick what works for you. But I'm just showing you that this is the way to get this data without really having the time to go through all of it. But the topics, again, can include poverty, can include lots of different kinds of data, school enrollment. We figured out, we utilized an example of people who hadn't finished high school. For example, if you want to make a case about education needs. So I'm going to stop sharing this right now. And Leo, if you can go back to my slides and I'll zip through the rest of them. I'm clocking this in at less than 9 hours, but more than you probably wanted. Okay, so this is one that I'm just showing you. You'll have the instructions on how to do it, but following these instructions, you'll be able to calculate how many people, how many households with income under $50,000 are paying half or more of their income on rent. This is a New York example from last year. It gives you all the instructions. And in the case of New York, more than half the people with incomes, or the households at that level, are paying more than half their income on rent. So help you make the case for the need for more housing assistance. Next slide. We already talked about Columbia University's monthly data. So that's something that can augment your message. We also have Household Pulse, and we talked about that a little bit. I don't really have time to talk about it much right now, but let's go on to the next slide. So this is one illustration. They have a kind of interactive tool where you can pick your topic, and you can't get all the breakdowns, but it will give you state data. In this case, for people who said that people sometimes or often didn't have enough to eat in the state. So it's helpful, but it doesn't give you everything. It doesn't break down by race or age. The next slide. But we wanted to take a look, at least at the national level, to show the difference in Household Pulse from 2 years ago, when people were getting those benefits, and very recently as last month. And you can see with some of these breakdowns that there was a big increase in the number of people saying that in the last 7 days, people sometime in their household, sometimes or often, didn't have enough to eat. You can see the racial disparities. You can see that when there are children in the household, it went up from almost 10% to 15%, talking about that kind of hardship. So we will give you instructions on how you can calculate that in your own state. It's a little time consuming, but you can do it. So next slide. So, making the case, you've kind of heard a lot about it. You can use the data to talk about why we need to bring back the expanded child tax credit. And you can use Celinda's evidence that the public strongly supports that. You can use it to talk about protecting SNAP. There's a farm bill coming up. And in other cases, there are people in Congress who want to restrict SNAP. We have to fight against that, and we have to seize opportunities to go in the other direction. And the data that you'll see starting on Tuesday will perhaps tell us that SNAP lost some of its anti-poverty fighting strength, and we have to prevent that from being worsened. So next slide. Other kinds of data, I gave you examples. We've got appropriations battles. I gave you examples of childcare. You can make a case using the data examples, education, housing. Congress wants to cut WIC, not everyone in Congress, but some, and we have to fight against it. The data that we've talked about similarly makes a case for WIC. So we'll again give you instructions on how to get your state data. Next slide. We've got an experiment here. We have a toolkit that we will send you. The hyperlink is there, but when you get it, it'll be live. And it will include a template email that you can send to Congress, and you can use all the data that'll be coming to you to fill in the blanks that you see there and write about making the case for your own state. And then you can click and send, and you will have reached Congress. So we're trying to make it easy, and this is a way. Next slide. This one, and you can go to the next slide, are two examples of social media graphics. Leo, who's moving all the slides, is a great expert in this. We'll send you all of this and more so you can use social media to make the same kind of points. And it's possible we're coming, not quite the end. I've told you about all the things you're going to get, and this says it all over again, so I won't. And the very slide, I think, is the last slide, in which I'm thanking you. You have all these opportunities to craft a compelling message, but without you, those messages kind of lie lifeless on a shelf somewhere. So thank you for being the messenger that decision makers need to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. A lot there. And just to reiterate, all the materials, all the slides, all the documentation, everything will be sent to you in an email. But this is not one and done. The work continues, and you need to make sure you are totally plugged into CHN. So if you are not either on the Wednesday calls or the Thursday state and local calls, you need to sign up for those, because those calls allow experts from all the different organizations within CHN to tell you what is timely and what actions are needed at this particular point in time. So stay informed and plug into CHN's action agenda. And also, in addition to the calls, make sure you're getting all the emails and all the information from CHN. And if you are not a member or a supporter of CHN, you need to be, because that's the juice that keeps this engine purring. So we welcome you and your support to CHN. Thank you to Deb, thank you to Ishmael, and thank you to Celinda for your expertise and great information.
So I know we're at time, and there are a lot of questions, and we'll hang on to the questions from the Q&A, and when we send the follow-up email, we will do our best. Many of the questions will be answered as you get the materials, but I see questions like, why is supplemental poverty measure higher in certain states, and that's surprising, and I would need to take a look before I could give an intelligent answer anyway. So we will do our best to answer questions, but be on the lookout for the follow-up emails. I think you'll find the instructions pretty clear to follow. We'll also just send you a lot of stuff when the data come out. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing to lift up all these issues.
Great, and make sure we include all the sign up links and information because people want to sign up. So thank you. Thanks, Leo, for all your help in producing and getting us all on this very important webinar. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon and good advocacy.